This afternoon we are in a late model JK with a LT1 8-speed. I want to clarify some misconceptions about what is an LT, what is an LS, what is a Hemi, and what's in between, because yes, there is stuff in between. So let me start by saying the LT is pretty much one of a kind engine in today's V8 world. The LT has advanced technology, and when I hear guys refer to the LT as an LS, it really isn't a correct analogy, because the LT takes the LS to a different level. One, the LT can run the 8 and the 10 speed high gear transmissions, and that's huge, because if you compare the 5 speed, the 6 speed to the 8 and the 10 speed, there's definitely some advantages to the high gear transmissions. Two, the LT has direct injection, which most of the other V8s don't have. Direct injection does run a high pressure fuel system, which is going to give you better combustion efficiency. So we can run a higher compression ratio, especially when we combine that with CVVT. CVVT is not very well understood. Continuous variable valve timing means that the cam can phase anywhere from park to wide open. The older LSs and the Hemis that have variable valve timing basically have two positions, on and off. And having full control of that camshaft is huge, because it allows you to control cylinder pressure. And what that means, especially with a high gear transmission, is the engine is always on the pipe, as we used to say. It's always ready to go. You have instant power because you can phase the camshaft rather than downshift the transmission. You can do that for economy, you can do that for power. And after driving these LTs for a while, I started to get used to this CVVT and how it takes this high compression and harnesses that power, because the potential energy of the engine is based on how much compression you have, the size or the liters of the engine. And while that can be a downside, because the larger engine you go, the larger the pumping losses are, the LTs can reduce cylinder. MDS, multiple displacement system in the Chryslers, AFM, active fuel management in the GMs, and now DFM, dynamic fuel management. They're all designed around making a larger displacement engine more efficient. So of course the LT has that technology built into it. Now the first misconception is that these LTs are really complicated because they have this 2 to 8 cylinder mode. That's dynamic fuel management, and that is in the newer L84, L87. The LT1 is an AFM engine, which basically means it's a 4 and 8 cylinder, and that technology has been around a long time. And sure, back in the mid-2000s when that started to get implemented into the LS engines, there were some teething issues, whether it was the oil pressure. One of the things was the AFM lifters, if they were overpressurized, would collapse. So if you started your engine in sub-zero temperatures and revved it up, you had a good chance of damaging the AFM lifters. Some guys said they were noisy. They put extra pressure regulators in the oil pans on the AFM engines. But the bottom line is, by 2009, 2010, in our experience, most of the AFM issues were gone. And in the LTs, at the very beginning, 2014-15, they did have some push rods bending and some other issues, but they got that sorted. And today's LTs are just awesome. The LT1s are extremely powerful, and we see very, very few AFM, if any, AFM issues. Same thing with the L86 and the L83 and the other engines that we use. We did our first L87, and that was a new experience. But at the end of the day, this technology has been around a long, long time. So let's quickly go through some of the other features of the LT that separates it from most of the other engines out there. It has the high compression, and when I say high compression, an LT1 has 11.5 to 1 compression, and it runs on pump gas, and that's really huge. GM did a good job allowing an 11.5 to 1 engine run on pump gas. Another misconception is that these V8 JKs with 37s and 40s can only get 9 or 10 miles to the gallon. Now that bothers me a little bit, because for years now I've been seeing 12, 14, 16 miles to the gallon in these heavy JKs with 40s and LTs, and it is because of the additional technology that they have. My Denali will break 20 miles to the gallon fully loaded, and that's a large heavy vehicle. It's an XL, and it's definitely due to the technology in the LT engine. The LT engines have a dual stage oil pump, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One obviously is efficiency. If you're putting a lot of pressure out all the time, especially in a cold start. You don't need that, and that's using energy. A cold start is important because the oil is thicker and you don't want to damage components, so being able to stage that back is a good thing. And then when you get on it and you need that extra protection, you can pump up the oil pressure. So while the LT hasn't really broke any new ground as far as technology goes, direct injection has been around for a long time. Ford's been doing it, the Europeans have been doing it. Continuous variable valve timing has been around, but I think it was considered too expensive or just not required in a good old American V8, because good old American V8s have a lot of torque, and an overhead valve V8 is going to perform right up there with the smaller displacement engines. But to get more power and efficiency out of these engines, GM did two things that I think contributed. One is the CVVT, so you can control that cylinder pressure very accurately. And two, they combined it with high gear transmissions. The 8 and the 10 speeds are just awesome. The 8 and the 10 speed combined with the CVVT mean these engines act almost like an electric motor. The power is always there whenever you get on it. Whether it's the camshaft advancing or the transmission downshifting, it's very seamless, it's very smooth. There's no waiting for the engine to rev up to get into its power band or the transmission to downshift. The power is just always there. The gear spacing in the transmission is tight. The torque of the 6.2 liter with the direct injection and the CVT is always there. It just allows these engines to go to the next level. Again, this is not technology that is unknown. This technology has been around a long time, but GM worked it into their mainline V8 engines. And I think that's what's going to give the GM engines longevity. You're seeing some of the other V8s go along the wayside, except for really high performance applications, where GM's pretty much putting these in all their trucks and SUVs, and of course their sport cars. So GM is evolving the V8 rather than going to a high-tech V6 or a turbo 4-cylinder or an electric motor or whatever else is out there. And as long as GM is doing that, we're going to take advantage of it. So as far as the complexity goes, I hear guys talking about, oh, well, the LTs might just be too complicated. And the reality is they're not. GM has to warranty these things. There's millions of them out there. Yes, they have problems just like every other powertrain out there. But at the end of the day, the advantages you're getting in an LT now outweigh any of the potential problems, in my opinion. If you go back to 2016, when Motec started doing the LT conversions, you will see I had some ambiguity. I wanted to make sure that the technology was rationalized, that the transmissions were sorted, because pretty much all the manufacturers had transmission problems when they started stacking the gears up. My Mercedes had problems in my 7-speed. The Chryslers, the 8 speeds, the 9 speeds, they all had problems. But after a few years, GM had it sorted out. And I can tell you, we got lots and lots of LTs on the road. And for the most part, the reliability is pretty much up there with everything else. Now, one of the big issues with the LT, at least when it comes to other manufacturers, is integrating it into a non-GM platform. So there's been several approaches. As most of you know, Motec uses OE harnesses, OE computers, modules, operating systems. That way these engines can be serviced and diagnosed and repaired just like any other GM vehicle. I know that there's LTs out there that have been castrated. What that means is they remove the direct injection and put port injection in. They change the heads. They make it run like an old LS, like a Gen 3 LS or a Gen 4 LS. And by the time you've done that, you've really removed a lot of the advantages of the LT engine. In addition, you're running hacked operating systems. And there's even some guys out there running these LTs on the Chrysler operating system, which is the last thing we want to do. We want everything as OE-GM as we can get it. Now, for about a decade, Motec has run an interface module so that we can run the GM side pure and then run the Chrysler side pure and just have a bidirectional control in between. Now, of course, that was a little complicated in the beginning using digital analog, but eventually we evolved into CAN, and integrating something over the CAN is just, I'm not going to say it's easy because the coding can be difficult, but the actual implementation is easy. And for guys that say, oh, you got an extra module or whatever, think about this. The average car, or let's just say the tow rig that they bring out to the track, can have 30, 40, 50 modules or more. So adding one module to the network is a drop in the bucket. What's more important is the engine and the powertrain run the way they were intended to by the manufacturer. There's no mechanical modifications. The operating system is what the manufacturer intended for that engine. And these LTs, while they have evolved and become reliable, there's a lot of technology that goes into the operating systems on these. The E92 controller and the E90 and some of the others have high voltage drivers for the direct injection, because the direct injection in these run at thousands of PSI. So when you go away from the GM controls and you go to some other control, whether it's aftermarket like Holley, or you try to run it within a Chrysler system, you're getting away from the GM controls and you're dumbing the engine down so it's acting like a Gen 3 LS or a small block Chevy or an early Hemi. So if you take an LT engine and you remove the direct injection, you remove the variable valve timing, you remove all the advantages that the engine had because you don't want to run a GM controller, then the engine really isn't an LT. It's a Gen 3 LS, it's an early Hemi. In my opinion, the LT needs the high gear transmission, the 8 and the 10 speed. When you combine that with all the technology in the LT engine, it's just a phenomenal combination. And not just in a Jeep. I got a 17 Denali XL, like I have mentioned multiple times, and I can cruise all day long in that thing at 80, 90 miles an hour, getting close to 20 miles to the gallon. So let's not confuse the LT with an LS. Let's not confuse the LT with a Hemi. Let's not confuse the LT with a hybrid, something that's been modified to dumb it down. The LT is a modern overhead valve American V8 that has applied technology to allow it to be not only as efficient, but as powerful, if not more powerful, than everything that has come before it. I think of the LT1 rated at 460 horsepower, and that doesn't tell the story. The story in the LT1 is torque and how much area they have under that torque curve, because the power comes on immediately. And the LT1 at 460 horsepower is more powerful than my LS6 Chevelle, which is rated at 450 horsepower in 1970. And that engine is extremely radical. It's rump, rump, rump. It's burning your eyes with hydrocarbons. It's setting alarms off in underground parking lots. Where the LT1 idles at 450 RPM and can outrun my Chevelle. So you're doing yourself a disservice if you try to compare the LT1 to any of these other powertrains. The LT is evolutionary, but it is also very differentiated from what came before it. Now, is there higher tech V8s? Yeah, of course there is. Double overhead cam, remember the ZR1 engine, the Mercury Marine build, 4-valve engines, all that stuff. But for a mainstream pickup truck or SUV, the LT is a very advanced engine. Another big advantage of the LT is GM's still making them. They're still cranking them out in 2022. This means future emissions compliance, because remember guys, you got to put an engine in that's at least the same year newer than your vehicle, and it doesn't matter what your state says. What matters is what the Fed says. So if you live in the United States, you are under US EPA guidelines, whether you're required to have an inspection or not. If you have a JL or a JT, an LS3 isn't going to hack it. We don't know what the future of the Hemi is, but there's a lot of rumors out there it's going to be axed pretty soon. And as long as GM keeps pushing the envelope with these LTs, we need to take advantage of it. And there's a lot of thought that went into making these LT engines efficient for fuel economy. It's a couple days later. You remember the honeymooners where Ralph was always calling his mother-in-law a blabbermouth? Well, that's me. The SD card ran out, so I got to try to remember where I left off so I know where to pick up. But here's the bottom line. Don't let anybody fool you with the LT. The LT is the latest and greatest in good old American V8 technology. Now, we're not talking about 4-valve, dual cam, all that other stuff, because yeah, you can get that in a Ferrari. The ZR1 had it and other engines have it. We're talking about a truck they're putting in a Silverado that some kid's going to go out and beat the crap out of. As far as this high technology being unreliable, in my opinion, that's pretty much unfounded. I put tens of thousands of miles on these LTs. GM has tested them for millions of miles. And yeah, if you're going to be circle track racing or running in Baja, maybe you want to go with an LS3 or an older style engine. Not many guys go with a Hemi because of the weight and the lack of support. The GM powertrains have really ruled over the decades, all the way back to the 1950s. And don't get me wrong, I'm a really big Mopar fan. I think the 340 engine, the 340 6-pack especially, is one of the best engines ever built. So what can the LT offer? Well, it can pretty much do everything better than before. More power, more torque, more economy, better drivability. There's just no downside to it. And then when you combine it with the late model transmissions, it's just a phenomenal combination. So when you hear naysayers talk about the LTO, it's got more computers, oh, there's an extra module, there's a whatever. Really what they're trying to say, in my opinion, is that they can't support the LT. And they're trying to go back to older technology, which they can support. If you look at SEMA, a few years ago, it was all LS. Everybody was doing the LS7s and the LS9s and you name it. You go to SEMA now, and LT stuff is everywhere. There's just no denying that it is a superior powertrain. When you can run an 11.5 to 1 engine on pump gas with continuous variable valve timing and friction reducing technology like dual stage oil pumps and cylinder deactivation, there's just not much else that can compare with it. And when I hear guys say, oh, don't expect more than 10 miles to the gallon in your JK, every week I drive these heavy JKs on 40s up to Utah, or I just went to Idaho, and I'm pushing 14, 15, even 16 miles to the gallon. Now, yeah, a lot of that depends on how you drive. However, I'm never seeing 9 or 10 miles to the gallon. So 6 years ago when we did our first LT swap, my video was about, I'm not really sure, we have to wait and see, let's keep doing the LS's. And yes, there was some growing pains with the LT, but right now I can tell you from experience, tens of thousands of in-the-seat miles on these LTs, they are superior. When you combine them with an 8 or a 10-speed transmission, there's nothing else like it. Now, yeah, the Hemi's made a lot of advances going to the 8-speed and all that, but it's still not on the same level. We continue to support the LS's, and they're a great powertrain. The LS is simpler, and I want to say less costly, but really that's starting to change because as the LS's get long on the tooth, they were end-of-lifed years ago. Parts are getting a little bit harder to get and maybe a little bit more expensive. Really not too much though. The LS is still well supported, so if you go that route, you're going to be fine for years to come, just like you can still buy parts for the small block Chevy. But the other options out there, I'm not really sure. Ford makes some awesome engines like the Coyote, but you're not seeing guys putting those in JKs very often. They're really expensive and custom programming and transmission. Now, Ford did go in with GM on the 10-speed, as well as Toyota, Honda, and others, and it's a phenomenal transmission. But you're just not seeing the V8 powertrains like GM is doing. I've heard rumors the Hemi's days are numbered. You guys out there buying the JL Hemis, in my opinion, I would treat them more as a collector item than I would something to go out and beat up, because when and if they start restricting Hemi production, those things are probably going to be worth some money. I have a 70 Challenger Trans Am, or TA, basically the same vehicle as the AAR Coda. Remember the All-American Racing Coda Dan Gurney ran? Now, they were never really competitive in Trans Am racing. The Camaro kind of took over after the Shelbys and the Mustang. But I'll tell you, that little 346 pack, 3 carburetors on a 340 cubic inch engine. Now, of course, the Trans Am engines were limited to 5 liters, so Ford and GM went to the 302, and Chrysler did something funny. They changed the crank or the stroke or something, and I think they were down to a 305 or something like that. But that little 346 pack is probably one of the most powerful small blocks that I own, and I own a lot of them. Anyway, the moral of that story is I bought that car in 1976 when I was in high school, and I kept it all these years. I saw the Challengers and the Chargers and the Camaros go to the wrecking yard, the Crusher, back in the 70s and 80s because of the gas crisis, and they were dinosaurs and pigs. But I held on to that car, and I still have it today. And I was driving the other day, and I saw a Challenger TA, a new one, driving around. So everything that's old is new again. And as far as the Hemi JL goes, I think it's a really fun vehicle to drive, but it's more of a novelty market. It's more of something that I would just kind of hold on to. And I'm going to finish the video with this. A lot of you guys call me and say, hey, should I buy a JL? I really like my JK. I love my JK. I've got a lot of money into it. I got the suspension I want on it. I've got all the interior mods I want. But I really don't want to go out and spend $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 on a JL and then do a conversion, whether it's a Hemi or an LT or an LS. So my advice to you is if you really like your JK, keep it. Do an engine conversion. I don't care if you do a Hemi. I don't care if you do an LS. I don't care if you do an LT. But if you got a vehicle set up exactly the way you want it, put the powertrain in it you want. That's how I started Motec. I had a vehicle I really liked, but I hated the engine. And I didn't hate the 3.8 liter engine for what it is. It's not a bad engine. When they put those in the Caravans, they were actually pretty good. They did burden it with a 4-speed transmission that was high friction. By putting it in a JK, it put it under a tremendous amount of stress. Guys would go to a 38, 40-inch tire, the 4-speed transmission, and even the 6-speed transmission. They didn't have the gear diversity that that little 3.8 needed to perform at its best. If you put an 8-speed in a 3.8, it would be a lot better. No, it wouldn't be as good as a Pentastar, but it is an old-fashioned push-run engine. So 6 years ago, I was driving on this same road, and last set that I was going to wait and judge the LT. I have now judged the LT, and I can tell you that if I wanted to put a powertrain in my JK and I didn't have a V8 in it already, it would be an LT. I would probably go with the LT 5.3, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We're going to be doing an LT 5.3 test drive soon. If you have a really heavy JK40s, you live up in the mountains in Colorado, you tow a trailer, then of course the larger displacement engine will be better. So we're going to take this JK up to the mountain, and we'll see you soon.